States and its political culture, that the political culture of the United States is still substantially different from what we might see in Mexico or Canada. It's important to remember that even though we think of the nation state system that we currently live in, we have the United States, we have Mexico, we have the United Kingdom, France, Germany. It's easy to think of that as being somewhat permanent. That's sort of the way the modern state system has always been that way. But it's important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily permanent. History has actually demonstrated many different types of ways for global society to be organized. It doesn't have to necessarily be through the nation state. Human political organization began with permanent agrarian societies in defined territories. So if we look at the earliest human civilizations, these are individuals who began producing agriculture in fixed spots. They began to organize with each other. They needed some form of governance over themselves. And so human political organization begins with these agrarian societies. It required sharing resources to protect themselves, and it really led to the first political organizations. These types of organizations really emerged and began to become quite powerful in the Eastern Mediterranean. If we think of the Greek and Roman civilizations, they also had strong ties to Africa and the Near East. Of course, the Greek city-states were a much more local way of political organization than what we're currently used to with the modern nation-state system. And as we move a little bit farther in history, states could also be political organization could also be through empire, and the Roman Empire is a good example of this. An empire is a large-scale political entity that is made up of smaller political communities. These smaller political communities are typically dominated by a central power. So, for example, in the Roman Empire, Rome was the central power, and it dominated all throughout Europe. Any region in Europe was dominated by Rome at that time, and it's typically held together by a force. The Roman Empire used force, the threat of violence, to hold its empire together. And of course, there were relations of domination and subordination. Rome dominated, while if you were living in, for example, Spain or France, you were subordinated to Rome. The Roman Empire had very important implications for Western civilization. It was the basis for the legal system in Europe. It also, of course, contributed to the spread of Christianity and Christian culture throughout Europe. It's also important to remember that, however, there are other important historical empires, including the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian empires. These are, of course, in the Middle East and in Africa. We have Mali and the Ottoman empires. We also have, it's important to remember the important empires of the Americas, the Aztec, Mayan, and Incan civilizations, and of course the Chinese Empire, which lasted for several centuries. Okay, so the Roman Empire is not the only important historical empire to keep in mind, but it did have the most important ramifications for political organization in Europe. And if we look at the development of the modern state system, it's very important to look at European colonial empires, particularly the British Empire. Had a huge impact on modern international relations because it spread English culture and English political ideas, and with it, it spread the idea of the European state system. Some scholars actually suggest that we currently live in an age of empire. They suggest that even though there's no centralized authority or territorial center such as Rome, that transnational corporations owe no allegiance to a particular territory, and they dominate relations with a bunch of subordinate types of entities. Other scholars suggest that the United States itself is a new empire, or they describe it as an empire in denial. They suggest that the United States has an international order that it directly benefits from. There are still relations of domination and subordination. The United States reaps dramatic economic benefits from the rest of the world. The only difference these scholars claim is that it does not take direct political control, but this, of course, makes that claim controversial because when we think of empire, we typically think of direct political domination of other smaller territorial units. And so there's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of controversy as to whether or not the United States really can be conceptualized as an empire. So when we think of the rise of the modern state system, it's associated with the rise of science, technology, and industrialization in Europe. This allows Europe to develop the kind of military capacities that are going to enable it to colonize the rest of the world. But If we look at Europe in 1500, it's by no means obvious that Europe is going to be the region that's going to become primed to colonize most of the rest of the world. Because at this point in 1500, it's fragmented politically. It's nowhere near as powerful as other civilizations, such as the Chinese civilization. It's held together politically more than anything by the Catholic Church, and it's not until this religious authority is challenged by the Protestant Reformation that we begin to see dramatic change in Europe. We have the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which more or less ends the extreme religious warfare of Europe. It results in the promotion of religious coexistence. And what we see in the Peace of Westphalia is the rise of the state system in Europe, because the decision is made that it is going to be the state and not religion that is going to hold predominant political power over issues of war and peace, diplomatic representation, and treaties. It's a very important event in the history of the modern state, because it's the founding of the modern sovereign state. States will be autonomous, and they will not face intervention from the outside, particularly from organizations like religious organizations such as the Catholic Church or Protestant religious authority. When we talk about sovereignty, what we're talking about is autonomy in foreign policy and exclusive competence in international affairs. Okay, what this means is that the state is going to be allowed to set its foreign policy, its relations with other states, okay, and it's going to have exclusive competence in internal affairs. No other state is going to be able to step in and tell another state what it should do domestically with its own population. Of course, we see that the principle of sovereignty is often neglected, has often been neglected, just because there were principles of sovereignty in Europe that did not prevent constant warfare in Europe for 3 centuries after the Peace of Westphalia. And sovereignty, of course, comes with its own complicated moral questions. Do states have a right to sovereignty if they engage in humanitarian abuses against their citizens? Have states at that point, in some sense, forfeited their right to sovereignty? And is it the responsibility of other states then to step in and prevent humanitarian abuses from occurring? And with sovereignty, it's important to keep in mind that sovereignty at the national level produces anarchy at the international level. Okay, because since no institution can step in and tell a state what it's doing, what that means is that there's no overarching authority that can tell states what to do. There's no international level governance that tells states how they should engage in their own domestic policies and how they should interact with each other. So states live in an environment where no international government regulates their relations. What we see then is by the end of the 19th century, the state system is entrenched in Europe and the Americas. It doesn't exist at this point in much of the rest of the world. But the state system is going to be exported to the rest of the world through European colonization. Most of the world is going to come under direct control of European powers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. After World War II, that's when we see the principle of national self-determination become much more powerful. Colonized countries, the idea is that they should have the right to rule themselves. Newly independent colonies then, once they are granted independence from European colonial rule, they are going to mimic the structure of European-style states. Even states that hadn't been colonized by Europe, such as Japan and Turkey, are also going to adopt the European-style state. And that then leads us to the modern state system that we currently live in, which of course is most prominently marked by sovereign relations. States have autonomous control within their own boundaries, and they have the power to regulate relations between their states. There's no international authority that regulates relations between states, and so what we have is an anarchic system of states. Okay, there's no governing authority over states. States are the ultimate political authority, and there's no political authority above states. So that's going to do it for this lesson. Be sure to submit any questions that you might have over the lecture, and do be sure to take the quiz as well. Thanks.